She carried everything she owned in a small leather bundle and a secret the doctor had folded into the silence. There would be no children for her. The bundle was lighter than the grief. The secret sat heavier than the weight of any trunk she had once owned. Wind picked up the prairie dust and braided it through her hair as the wagon creaked toward the Rowins' place. An open gate cutting the horizon into a new sky. Miriam had learned to keep to herself the kind of grief that people treat like a contagious thing. It was a hush she kept between the bones of her and the places no one entered anymore. The empty room where a husband's coat had hung, the small funerary rituals no one else witnessed. When you are told, so quietly and at a bedside, that your body will not give you what the world expects, the world shifts under you. It is not only the ache of wanting, it is the sudden hollow where identity once fit, the social mirrors that crack. She had driven until the fences looked like fingers and the dust tasted like possibility. Colt Rowins met her at the edge of his yard with hands that had the slow steadiness of someone who put things back together. He was not the sort to ask about where she had come from. He looked, measured, and nodded in a way that made introductions unnecessary. He wore a coat that smelled of saddle oil and wood smoke, and his voice was the soft part of a storm, quiet, inevitable. There were 3 children at his back: Etta, who watched anyone new like a hawk, Samuel, who had more mischief than a pocketful of pebbles, and little Eli, who stuck close to Etta's hip and spoke in the quick, uttered truths of younger boys. They were careful at first, as if their house had its own guard dogs made of silence. She showed him the small bundle with a practical motion, hands that had learned to hide nothing without reason. He handed her a cup of coffee before he gave her a question. The coffee tasted of roast and dawn, and a hand that knew coffee by feel. In the kitchen, under the low light and the sound of pans, Miriam quietly said the thing she had carried for years because the silence had become too loud at the edges. "I can't have children," she said, somehow ashamed for speaking what the doctor had said plainly to her. The words seemed to sink the way stones sink in ponds. They settled into the room's warm pockets, the sunlight over the table, the steam from the coffee, the slow creak of the child's chair. There was a small motion in the room, Etta's knuckles whitening on the table, Samuel looking at his shoes as if the boards might open beneath him, Eli making a soft noise that was not a laugh, but the beginning of one. The house smelled like baking bread and hay. The ranch felt as if it had always had room for sorrow, but sorrow here was to be met by hands, not by lectures. Colt looked at Miriam. He looked at her as if he were choosing what to do next. Measure, then act. He set his cup down with a careful hand and did the simplest thing of all. He leaned forward and spoke a line so small and so quiet that it could have been missed. "That's all right. There's enough love here for both of us." It was not a proclamation. It was not a vow laden with promises. It had no drama, no sudden flaring of redemption. It was a plain fact, uttered across a table. The way he said it, steady, without flourish, unmoored something inside her. For the first time in a long while, the secret that had felt like a verdict loosened its grip. The kitchen air seemed to rearrange itself around the idea that she could belong in more ways than the world had allowed. If this is a story that touches something inside you, stay with it. This is about finding a way back to belonging when the world calls you broken. She began by washing dishes. A job is a good way to learn a place, hands in hot water, the rhythm of scrubbing, the small inventory of what is yours and what is not. Colt had given her a room with a window that looked out onto the barn and the low sweep of the valley. Her bed creaked when she turned, but she slept. There were small mercies. The sound of children's feet on the porch in the morning, the smell of bacon in the pan, the way the dogs settled at her feet as if they had always known her scent was not dangerous. Days had a steady, useful shape at the Rowins. Before dawn, A kettle sang on the stove, and Colt's voice was the anchor that told time. There was a season to milking and a season to mending fences. Weather carved its instructions into hands. Miriam learned the names of the tools: bolt, awl, hitch, and the sound each made when someone who knew them used them. She learned the way a horse's flank heaved under a palm, how to read an animal's fever in the looseness of its jaw, how to talk to a frightened calf in phrases nothing like English until it counted as comfort. The children watched her in the way children watch anyone who is new, but does not leave. Etta was the most careful. She asked few questions, and when she did, they were tests more than curiosity. "Can you ride?" she asked once, as if a woman's skill with a horse might be proof of her worth. Miriam smiled and let her hop up behind Colt, when Colt took them on the slow last lap of the pasture. The boy's laughter at a small lurch in his stomach softened the sharp edges around both girls. Etta's guard, worn thin by the wear of losing a mother before she could understand what a mother's absence looked like in daily weather, eased in increments. She began to sit on the porch longer when Miriam was there, letting the younger boys climb in her lap while she read from a book of short stories the ranch had kept for rainy afternoons. Samuel and Eli were easier to win. They loved the bluntness of pies and the theater of chores. One afternoon, Eli tied a piece of string around Miriam's finger and declared her our helper in a way that made the boys' acceptance a quiet, binding thing, like a stitch. Samuel learned to steal a piece of pie from her apron without getting caught, and when Miriam pretended to scold him, he grinned as if found favors were the only kind of magic. Belonging here arrived in small acts, rather than grand confessions. It was the way Colt left an extra blanket over the chair where she sometimes sat, the way Etta placed a chipped cup beside her when she returned from field work. It was the way Samuel, whose hands were never empty, fetched a nail or handed a bucket without being told. Miriam began to measure herself, not by what she could not give, but by the care she could offer. A thing shifted from inside, a slow, cautious thaw. There were quiet sacrifices, too. Some evenings, when the house had closed and Colt read letters from a man gone to distant land years ago, Miriam would stand a while in the washroom and let tears fall until the lines of the mirror were blurred. Grief doesn't disappear here. It is quieter, sitting alongside new, small joys. She sometimes woke with a mouth full of the taste of her own longing, the distance between what had been and what might yet be. But the texture of life, the pulling of weeds, the mending of a torn sleeve, holding a frightened foal, became a way of keeping that grief company instead of letting it live alone. She learned about trust in practical terms. Trust meant you could hand someone your misgivings without them turning them into a judgment. Trust meant Colt would stop his tasks and look at her when she spoke about the doctor's room, not with pity, but with the kind of calm that sorts information instead of amplifying shame. He did not try to fix anything he did not understand. He simply made room. There were nights when the house felt too small for the whole of their quiet. Once, after a day of rain had soaked the fields and turned them into brown stretches of clotted earth, Miriam sat at the end of the porch with a shawl across her knees and watched Colt and the children inside. Laughter moved through the window, low and domestic. A calf bleated across the yard. For a simple moment she let herself imagine a life not void of wanting, but full of other kinds of fruit, children made of patience and ordinary presence. She said nothing aloud. The thought itself felt like betrayal to the doctor's quiet verdict. But then Etta came and stood on the bottom step, as if she had made up her mind on small, decisive feet, and asked Miriam if she wanted to come inside to play cards. Miriam nodded. Etta's smile was a small, private thing that belonged only to them. The barn was where life kept its louder rhythms. Animals do not explain their purposes in words. They act. The barn's rafters stored the smell of hay and the slow, clean smell of animal breath, the kind of scent that does not judge. It was there, on a night when the sky held a sharp, particular cold, that the foal came. They had been watching a mare that had shown signs of restlessness for days. Colt had said, dry and matter-of-fact as ever, "I'll need an extra hand tonight." Miriam offered both hands, and Colt nodded. The children slept, dreams of school and goats and small adventures carrying them through the dark. Colt stayed awake to listen. Night pinched the edges of the barn down to small pockets of lantern light. The rain had stopped, and the world smelled of soaked earth and the crisp promise of a turning season. The mare's labor was a slow machinery of will work. Miriam felt something animal and prime moving through her when Colt guided her hand to feel the mare's flank, to check for signs of distress. She was not a mare-birthing expert. She did not pretend to be. But she knew how to be steady. She knew the cadence of breathing and the way hands could pass on calm without words. When the foal slid out, wet and bewildered, it made a sound that pinched at the chest, an insistence of life. The foal's legs trembled like new poles of light, and then found their first clumsy strength. Miriam's palm, sensible and warm, rested on the foal's side. Colt's hands, rough and sure, helped the mare to stand. The foal shook, lifting its head as if testing the world and finding it willing. "You helped," Colt said later, as they stood with the animal between them. A small, breathing miracle that was only partly miracle, and mostly the plain thing of bodies working. Miriam laughed then, a sound that was close to crying. She had not realized how much she needed to be needed in the quiet way of midwifery that is not about bearing a child, but about receiving new life into the world and making room for it. The children were up at dawn when the foal took its first full stride, all awkward, hopeful energy. Etta pressed her cheek against the mare's warm flank with the reverence of someone meeting a thing she had watched manage struggle and triumph. Samuel danced in nervous circles, as if afraid the foal might vanish in a puff like a conjurer's rabbit. Eli tried to count the foal's spots and decided they were all wrong, which was, in his mind, a charming and definitive quality. They named the foal with shouts and immediate ownership. In the way children do, they gave it a name like it had always belonged in their mouths. They claimed it with the kind of fierce, practical affection Miriam had seen in so many small hands. The same hands that fixed toys, bandaged knees, and tied laces. The foal's first cry became a yardstick against which the household measured itself. Miriam, who had once felt like a body emptied of promise, stood amidst the newborns of the barn and realized she had participated in something that mattered. It mattered not because it replaced her loss, nothing could do that, but because it showed her how one could still bear with others, and by doing so, carry a kind of life. She understood then that carrying can mean more than the body carries. It can be the quiet, relentless keeping of things together, a blanket laid across a small animal, a hand on a shaking shoulder, the mending of a torn book. She carried life forward in tasks and presence. That morning, in the glow that settled like honey over the hay, Etta said something that lodged itself in Miriam's chest like a small, warm stone. They were all putting fresh water by the stall, and Etta, who had been watching Miriam's hands the way you watch someone who knows where to place theirs, paused and looked directly at her. "You're like a mother to us," she said, the words spilling out with the blunt truth of a child who has decided something in a heartbeat and needs no other evidence. Miriam felt a year of silence crack. There were 10 ways not to answer and 1 way to be brave. She walked to Etta, and without theatrics, she gathered the girl into an arm that was neither possessive nor shy. The hold was small, but exact. Samuel shoved his hands into his pockets, and Eli tried to hide behind his sister, proud and sudden, as if he had a new treasure. "You're like a family," Colt said later, when they were closing the barn. His voice was a quiet that did not ask for acknowledgement. He handed Miriam the lantern, and the light traced the lines of their faces, making them familiar in a way that made saying anything more complicated than thanks unnecessary. They stood for a moment listening to the newborn's breath and the mare's shift of weight. Miriam found herself saying aloud something she'd never thought to voice. "I didn't think I could stand here and not be missing." The sentence felt clumsy on her tongue. She tried to mean it with every syllable. "You don't have to stop missing," Colt replied. "Missing is nothing to be ashamed of. It happens whether you're here or not. Being here just means you're not carrying it alone anymore." His answer was practical, not a bomb of platitudes. It was the kind of response that recognizes grief as a fact, not a failure. It honored both absence and presence at once. Miriam understood then that this ranch might not make her whole in the way the world once promised. Instead, it offered her something closer: company for the long nights, hands to do the hard things, a place where small acts built up like gravel until it became a path. They returned to the house, to bread that had been browned in the oven, to the simplicity of a meal shared at a rough table. The children's chatter softened as they ate, the day's exertion making them calmer, their complaints about chores folded into jokes. Etta sat next to Miriam, and after clearing her throat, asked in a small voice, "Do you want to tell us anything about home?" Miriam thought of the house she had left, the rooms that remembered a husband's step, and then were empty, and how the doctor's words had echoed like a verdict. She thought how she had carried the secret like a stone in a pocket, a weight she would not show, because the world does not know how to hold other people's lack. But in this kitchen, with the lamp casting its honest glow, she realized she could tell them the truth and still be accepted. "I had a house once," she said, "and a husband. I lost them. The doctor told me I wouldn't have children. I thought that was the end of my story. I was wrong." Etta's hand found hers under the table and squeezed, a small, decisive pressure. "Good," Etta said, as if that were all the rejoicing needed. After the meal, Colt fixed a broken latch on the back gate while Miriam gathered the leftover bread into a cloth. They worked side by side, a choreography that builds knowledge without talk. It was in these moments of practical intimacy that a relationship formed its patterns, small silences that were not empty but filled with the comfort of shared labor. He showed her how to set the hinge straight, how to test for rot, the exact angle to drive a nail home. Her palms learned what his had known for years. There were neighbors in the valley who watched these things, as neighbors will. People notice when houses take in new faces. People keep their distance, or they do not. Some of the looks that followed Miriam across the lane felt like curiosity. Some felt colder. She was learning that stares were not only what you received as someone who had carried a loss. You also received them for being a woman in a place where old stories about what a woman's worth meant still lived. At first, only small ripples of gossip tugged at the edges, the kind that comes with farm life, a two-sentence rumor over fences, a brief pause at the post office. The children were school-ready and busy enough that the world's questions settled in the corners. But there are people for whom community is a ledger, and they keep accounts aloud. Miriam had known prejudice in the quiet corners of hospital corridors, and in the smirking absence of pity at family tables. She knew shame could arrive like a sudden gust, and sometimes the gust became a storm. That knowledge made her cautious, but it did not make her retreat. The ranch taught her a stubborn, practical courage. Stay present, do the work, answer with hands when words would do harm. So she did. Autumn folded itself into a geography of small changes. The leaves around the yard went from green to the dry, papery yellow of things remembered. Children's jackets became thicker. The foal grew from a wobbly newborn into a creature that bounded through the yard with the rawness of young life. Miriam watched, sometimes from the kitchen window, sometimes standing shoulder to shoulder with Colt as they mended a fence or patched a roof. She found herself thinking, not for the first time, that belonging is assembled from the repeated ordinary gestures of daily life, the kind of love that doesn't demand anything beyond showing up. One night, as they were all settling into a clean, ordinary quiet, Miriam stood on the porch looking at the sky. The stars were strange and sharp above the ranch. The air had a clear bite to it that made the porch lamp look softer by contrast. Inside, the sound of plates being cleared and the clatter of chairs were a domestic music. The children had gone to bed, and Colt was gone to check the fences one more time, because that's what men who love land do. They keep returning to it until it yields up its peace. Miriam wrapped her hands around a cup of tea and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the edges of her were not all frayed. She felt taut in a new way, not from holding on, but from being held. She had not forgotten the tests and the doctor's nicked blue glances. She had not stopped grieving the shape of the life she had thought would be hers. But something in her had learned to rest inside a room with other people's voices and still not be erased. She was not naive. The world beyond the yard would not always be gentle. People keep their old stories, and sometimes those stories come back to the door like unpaid debts. She could think of Agnes Marlowe, the sister of a man she had loved once, who carried opinions like an heirloom. Agnes's voice lived in Miriam's memory as a dry, high thing that catalogued failings. The thought of Agnes's judgments made Miriam's hands tighten on the cup. Still, that night she listened to the ranch breathe and let the idea of staying sink in. She had chosen this place in part because it asked less of her in the shape of making false promises. It asked her to be useful and present, and to accept being held in simple ways. That was a bargain she could make. As Colt reappeared at the gate, brushing dust from his coat, and smiling as if the dark had been a trivial errand, Miriam felt the small thrill of a new steady in her chest. He joined her without a question, and leaned on the porch rail, and for a long time they stood in companionable silence. Two people whose lives had been rearranged by losses and small mercies alike. "You ever think you could stay?" he asked quietly, not because he needed the answer immediately, but because the asking mattered. The question itself carved space for possibility. "I think so," Miriam said. The words felt plain but certain. She added, softer, "I want to." Colt nodded, as if that had been the only answer he had hoped for. "Good," he said simply. "We'll get by. We always do." For a while that was enough, but the valley keeps its memory, and every so often the past puts its hand on a shoulder to remind you it is still there. Dust moves over a road like the first hint of a story returning. On a morning when the horizon cast a thin band of light, a shape moved at the edge of the road. It was small at first, a cup of movement on the plain, but it became a wagon when the dust lifted and the axle creaked like a clock winding down. Someone was coming. Miriam felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the sort of ache that knows history will knock at your door when you least expect it. She walked to the fence line and squinted into the shimmer of heat where the road met sky. The wagon's figure was a woman with a posture that said she carried words like tools, ready to use them. Her dress was the kind that kept the smell of her own house on her like an armor. For a second, Miriam's memory filled the woman with a dozen faces, family, judgment, the shape of a past that could not forget. Etta joined her at the fence, small and curious. "Who is it?" she asked. Miriam swallowed, feeling the taste of rain coming. She had a certainty that did not come from hope, but from the plain knowledge that life, once started, invites other lives into its orbit, some welcome, some not. She turned to the child, held Etta's gaze, and said quietly, "We'll see." Then she watched as the wagon drew nearer, and the woman's face came into focus. A face Miriam recognized from a life she had tried to close the door on, the face of Agnes Marlowe, carrying her own luggage, and a smile that did not reach her eyes. The earth made a small sound under the wagon wheel. Dogs across the yard barked once and then settled, as if not to make unnecessary noise. The quiet stretched. For the first time since she had stepped onto the Rowins' place and let the world rearrange itself. Miriam felt the old shame shift to the surface, the secret she had tried to put down stirring like embers. She did not know what Agnes would say. People like Agnes do not ask questions out of concern. They measure with the language of ownership and shame. Miriam thought of the doctor's whispered verdict and of the tenderness she had been given at a table, and she realized how fragile this new belonging was, not fragile in itself, but subject to the weather of other people's voices. Etta squeezed her hand. The children stirred in the house, senses tuned to the presence of another adult. Colt came from the barn with his boots still dusty and his face set to a calm readiness. Miriam straightened, feeling the steadiness of her own spine strengthen under others' presence. She had been broken, not in the shape of being worthless, but in the wrenching private way that loss reorders a person. Here, though, something had been built from the small acts of daily life. She would not be swept away easily. Agnes's wagon stopped at the gate. The reins fell slack in the driver's hands. The woman climbed down with the deliberate motion of someone used to announcing herself. Her eyes took in the house and the barn with the attentiveness of a person who judges by the order of things. "You must be the woman," Agnes said, the sentence carrying the buoyancy of assumption. "I heard they'd let anyone in now." Colt stepped forward. His presence was not a shield, but a wall made of ordinary things. Steadiness, refusal to dramatize, the quiet authority of someone who holds a land and children. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "This is our place, ma'am," he said. "We make our own arrangements." Agnes's mouth thinned. Her eyes darted to Miriam as if the woman were a specimen she had come to inspect. "Miriam Marlowe," she said, as though the name held weight and accusation in equal parts. "I came to see what exactly you intend here. People have been talking." Murmurs moved through the yard like a low wind. Etta's grip on Miriam's hand tightened. The younger boys peeked from the back doorway, faces curious and a little fearful. Miriam felt every quiet that had come before line up behind her like a chorus. The doctor's quiet verdict, the years of loss, the tentative warmth of small hands. She could have fled then, returned to the small leather bundle and the road, and let the world's judgment be the final act in her story. She had done the retreating before. But something in her, fortified by the steady things she had done and the small people who had claimed her, moved forward instead. She looked at Agnes, and with as much plainness as she could, spoke what had been true and what she would not let be stolen again. "I'm not what you think I am," she said. "I'm not broken in the way you mean. I'm here, I work, I help. These children are my neighbors and my family now." Agnes's face worked in a way that showed disapproval like a badge. The woman's voice dropped like a stone when she answered, "You were always meant to marry and bear. That's how women in our line go forward. A woman without children. What is she for?" The question was not meant to be answered. It was a challenge. It was the catching of a net thrown broad and sure, meant to collect shame and toss it back like a commodity. For a heartbeat, silence hung. Miriam felt all the old words, the private verdict, the hospital's antiseptic air pulling at her. Then Colt spoke, and his voice was small, sure as a bell. "She's for this," he said, meaning the house, the children, the barn, the life in which things were kept and mended and loved. "She's for us. That's enough." The sentence landed not as triumph, but as a plain refusal of Agnes's ledger. It was the simplest kind of defense, naming what was. The children, who had witnessed the steady accumulation of care, moved as one toward the gate. Etta stood at Miriam's side like a young sentinel. Samuel and Eli followed, their faces set, as if they had been asked to swear an oath. "You're like a mother," Etta said, loud enough for everyone to hear, and in her voice the sentence had the conviction of a verdict that could not be overturned by those who counted kin by blood alone. Agnes's lip curled. "You'll ruin them," she spat, as if the worst thing in the world was kindness that had no lineage attached. "You'll teach them to accept less." Miriam felt the old shame flare. She also felt a new thing, the steady warmth of a body not carrying its burdens alone. Colt's hand rested briefly on her shoulder, not to claim, but to anchor. She met Agnes's gaze and, for the first time since a doctor had spoken into her future, spoke with a voice that was not small. "We don't accept less," she said. "We accept what is true. We make care. That's enough to raise a life." Agnes turned on her heel, as if the air itself had become shame, and she had no stomach for it. Her shoulders were set in a way that spoke of retreat. The woman climbed back into the wagon and drove off, dust turning the road into a ribbon of erasure. The valley seemed to hold its breath and then exhaled. The children cheered like it was a game won. Colt made a small private smile, and then returned to his tasks, as if life were both blow and mending, and both necessary. Miriam sat back on the porch and felt the sun lighten something in her chest. She had not been erased by someone who measured worth by narrow measures. She had resisted, not with raised hands or loud declarations, but by staying, by being useful, by letting the small people who had claimed her stand beside her. That night, when the house settled and the foals' breathing made a softer music at the barn, Miriam stood by the window and watched the lantern light swing. Samuel slept with his hands clutching a piece of twine. Eli had a face like a contented, sleepy bird. Etta lay awake for a moment, and then reached across the pillow to touch Miriam's arm in a casual, intimate gesture. "I'm glad you stayed," Etta whispered. Miriam held the small hand and felt the steady, luminous truth of the words. She had come to the ranch with a leather bundle, a history of loss, and a secret that had defined her. She had not expected to be met with a man who could say something as plain as, "There's enough love here." Nor did she expect to find acceptance in the small hands of children whose love was practical and immediate. She had not expected the birth of a foal to teach her that bearing life comes in more shapes than biology. But it had. She pressed her forehead to the cool glass and breathed in the scent of the night. The hay, the distant smoke, the land's exhalation after a day of work. The thought that rose inside her was not a cure or a promise. It was a plain, luminous fact. Here, in the rhythmic smallness of everyday things, she had a place that wanted her whole. She could be both a woman who had known deep loss and a presence that steadied others. The two truths could live beside one another, without cancelling. Some things had been mended, other things remained raw. The future still held knots that would take time to undo. Agnes's visit had proven that outside forces could stir dust that threatened to cover this fragile patch of belonging. Miriam knew the work was only beginning. She also knew she had a choice now, to stay, to take part in the daily tasks that were stitches, to let small hands and steady voices teach her how to carry life in ways that did not require a child to be born within her. She whispered once, to the house and to the land and to herself, "I'm home." The words sat in the room like an honest lamp, casting a steady light that did not deny the dark, but softened it. Beyond the yard, the road lay open and waiting. In the dark, something moved. An exchange of wheels and wind, a dust line, a far-off creek. It could be any passerby. It could be the world coming to see what place Miriam had carved for herself. The night held its breath, and the ranch answered with the surety of those who know hardship and keep working anyway. The foal's small cry rose in the barn like a pledge. New things are fragile, and they are possible. Miriam walked back to bed with the steady feeling of someone who has decided how to remain in the world, despite the shape of former losses. She had not been fixed in the way a bandage heals a wound. She had been gathered. The difference mattered. It was possible, she realized, to be broken, and also to be whole in ways that mattered. She folded the thin wool blanket around her shoulders and smoothed it against her knees. The house hummed with the low, habitual sounds of a family settling in for another night. The kettle's last sigh, the barn gate's slow click, a child's soft snore that slipped from wakefulness into steady sleep. She let the warmth sink into her palms and thought about other blankets she had wrapped herself in. Cold hospital linens, the stiff dressing of a mourning house. This one held the scent of home, smoke, flour, and a hint of the mare's hay. It occurred to her then that some stitches are made of ordinary things and that they can hold, if given time. Winter and spring measured themselves in chores. Snow softened the world into a muffled map of steps. Mud in March left traces of hoof and boot that told stories for weeks. Miriam learned how to read the small differences of a season the way she had once read a medical chart, attentive to detail, but less afraid of what she would find. In a way that surprised her, the world allowed room for both the old ache and a new occupancy. On mornings when the house was full of steam and the children's talk, the ache slackened like a rope loosened from its tautness. It did not unspool, but it stopped pulling at her limbs. Colt's presence was an everyday contour, no grand lines, only steady valleys and ridges that fit with her own. They worked side by side so often that tenderness began to show in small practical ways. A hand on a wrist when cold settled into the bones, an extra piece of bread warmed in the oven and set where she would find it, leaving the lantern lit at the gate because she knew her habit was to check the barn last. He did not dramatize these acts. He did not make speeches. That was the point. His care was a series of small, reliable motions that taught her the grammar of belonging. Words between them remained spare. Some evenings, when the children had been tucked in and the house thrummed with the slow cooling of plates, they would stand shoulder to shoulder and let the quiet do the talking. Once, when the moon was thin and silvered, Miriam found the courage to name a fear that had been gnawing at her. A fear not of being loved, but of being, finally, something other people could only measure by who she might leave behind. "What happens when you're gone?" she asked the dark, not looking for prophecy but for a kind of honest map. Colt considered the question as if arranging a fence post, certain, patient, with an idea in mind. "We'll leave things in order," he said. "We'll have a plan. But what I hope will matter most is that we learned to give each other hands when things fall apart." It was not a promise to forever. It was a way of making space for uncertainty which suited her better than any certainty ever had. She learned to let that answer be enough. Sometimes she'd trip on old grief in small ways, a scent that belonged to someone else, a song that made her eyes fill, a corner of the pillow that still remembered another's shape. Those nights, Colt was present without pressing, offering a quiet that respected the weight of what she carried. He never tried to erase the past. He acknowledged it with the kind of modest, steady gestures that taught her to stay present in the life she was living. The valley, in its slow way, began to notice a different rhythm. Neighbors who had kept a polite distance started to cross the lane with packets of preserves or a spare onion or a request to borrow a ladder. There were occasions. A neighbor's child fell ill, and Miriam sat with the child at the curb while a woman fetched the doctor. A fence post was replaced by hands already stained with tar. Her competence in these tasks altered the ledger of gossip. The ledger never erased itself entirely, but people started to add pages about her that were less susceptible to ridicule. "She helped with the calving," someone would say, or "she's got a steady hand." The changes were not all smooth. Agnes's wagon had kicked dust and left a mark, and while the woman's departure had been public, tongues retain impressions longer than people do. A grocery woman at the market made a remark meant to sting. A passing stranger's eyebrows lifted with what seemed like an inventory of her worth. Those moments prickled, but they existed alongside an accumulation of other moments. A neighbor who offered a loaf of bread without question, the church lady who asked her to bring the coffee for the ladies' meeting, children from other farms who came to play, and finding Miriam at the sink, treated her as if she'd always been part of the world. There were days when the old private verdict returned in a sharper voice. Once, in the early spring, a package arrived with a small folded note that had no return name. A cruel heirloom sent in the night. Miriam opened it in the kitchen, hands steady until she read the words inside. A suggestion that a family without blood was a hollow thing. She folded the paper over once and put it in the fire. The flame made a small, bright sound that seemed to swallow the insult without answering. She did not hide what had happened from Colt. He stood with his back to the stove, listening, and when she finished, he said one sentence that felt like scaffolding. "They'll have to live with what we build here," he said. "Not everyone will like it, and that's on them." His refusal to make the pain about anything but their work steadied her. It was the same kind of deflection he used with fence repair. Fix the broken thing, and the world is less likely to notice the jagged edges. Over the months, the children thinned, broadened the edges of family, in ways both tender and comical. Etta grew taller and more willing to shoulder tasks that once felt too big for her bones. Samuel's mischief turned into practical ingenuity. He could rig a hay trolley and did it with the concentration of someone who'd chosen a craft. Eli's questions grew like saplings, constant, surprising, and sometimes painfully straightforward. They asked the things that made adults stumble. Will you stay forever? Do you love us like a mother? Miriam answered each the best she could, with small truths and precise gestures. I'm here now, she would say, or, I care for you like someone who has chosen to be here. Those answers, delivered over the grind of chores or in the hush of a bedtime story, accumulated like the wood in the shed, enough, eventually, to keep a winter's fire. One evening in late spring, as the first green began to show in earnest, the valley staged a small festival at the church hall. It was the sort of event where community judged itself by the pies that arrived and the tunes people could remember. Miriam found herself, almost by accident, sorting chairs and carrying a stack of hymnals, while Colt negotiated a place to tether the horses. Agnes did not attend, but the spectre of her judgment seemed to hang in the rafters nonetheless, a memory of the sting of small cruelties. Yet in the bright room, amid the smell of coffee and varnished wood, Miriam felt an ease she had not allowed herself to believe in. People danced with a clumsy, earnest happiness. A woman she'd only known by nods pressed a warm biscuit into her hand and patted her shoulder. The dance that night was a thing of steady, ordinary intimacy. The men and women held each other with a rough politeness, the kind that comes from having hauled hay together and repaired roofs in weather so bad it brooked no pride. Colt asked Miriam to dance, not in a showy way, but as one farmer asks another to hand over a tool, necessary, respectful, and without any theatricality. They moved in the circle as if shifting timber, exact, careful. When a fiddler struck a particularly jaunty tune, children clustered to watch, and Samuel's grin made his face all boy and bright. For a moment, Miriam felt the world condensed into the warmth of cedar smoke and the press of bodies moving in a common rhythm. It was easy, and it was hard in a way she hadn't known love could be. Quiet, ordinary, and bracing. As the months matured, a new test arrived, not in the form of scandal, but of consequence. Colt's health, which had been the sort you could count on like a stable weather pattern, faltered in a small, decisive way. A hand injury that turned septic, a few feverish days, things that in a different life might have been handled with a doctor's more immediate attention. Here, help was measured by what the land offered and by what neighbors could share. Colt was stoic. He bit back annoyance at being slowed down, but he was human. Miriam found herself caring for him with the same mixture of steadiness and practical ingenuity she offered to animals. She cleaned the wound, boiled water until it would not make a man wise, and sat at the bed when he slept. There was an intimacy in those hours that demanded a different vocabulary. She washed his hair with the scent of soap, smoothed his brow with a hand that had learned to be firm where firmness mattered. He watched her with a gratitude so plain it felt like a mirror without ornamentation. "You keep things even," he said once, voice low from the pillow. "You make it less sharp." She laughed softly, more a sound like breath than merriment. "So do you," she said. The danger passed. It had not required a miracle. It had required patchwork and neighborly help and the stubborn dignity of ordinary care. The event did something to the landscape between them. It took the hypothetical of partnership, shared burdens, split nights, and rendered it into the factual, ordinary business of life. That was a different kind of closeness, and Miriam found she liked the way it felt to be needed in a way that matched how she wanted to be needed. Steady, present, and necessary in the plain ways. Agnes's shadow, however, was not finished. Some resentments compact into slow, determined mice, gnawing along the edge of the house. One bright morning, when the fields were already warm with the smell of new growth, a stranger from town rode up the lane and left a paper echo behind. A letter, precisely worded, that suggested inheritance and lineage and public opinion. The letter implied that a woman like Miriam, without children of her own, had no right to certain claims on property, that the family line deserved guardians who could pass on their name and lineage in blood. It was an insinuation geared to frighten rather than inform. The presence of that paper mattered because it exposed a fear that had less to do with Miriam personally than with an older, brittle idea of what a family should be. Colt read the paper with a steady hand, his face not faltering. He folded it carefully and set it between the plates on the table, as if it were an unwanted utensil. "We'll need to see what's actually in law," he told her, plain-eyed. "But whatever's on that page, it won't tell us how to love." He did not try to make the issue vanish. He proposed a plan, talk to a lawyer in the nearest town, gather paper, make a case for what had been built through hands and care. The act of taking practical steps, of refusing to be moved by threats cloaked in penmanship, felt like a defense of the life they had sewn together. Miriam watched as people came forward, neighbors, friends, those who had once been only acquaintances, and offered witness to the life she inhabited. She fed my lamb when I could not. She helped with the harvest. She was there when the springers calved. These were not grand endorsements. They were storied accounts of ordinary help. They mattered. The legal threat receded, not because it disappeared, but because it had been met by a community willing to testify to what counted: care. It was a slow kind of victory, one won by testimony and practice, rather than by a single heroic act. Months passed into a rhythm she had not known she could inhabit. Some mornings, she still woke with the echo of a doctor's words hovering in the air. But the echo no longer defined the whole of her. She learned new ways to answer the children's questions about lineage and meaning. When they asked why some things mattered more to other people, she told them stories of the heart and the hands. "You don't need to be blood to be family," she would say. "Family is what you make by staying and doing the small things." There were tender intimacies, private as the space between a saddle and a rider. Once, after a morning of particularly inventive repairs, Colt and Miriam sat on the back steps with cold glasses of lemonade. The day was bright, the sun burning golden oil into the fields. Samuel and Eli were chasing a rooster. Etta was threading a needle and humming a tune she'd picked up in town. They sat as if two people who had been shaped by solitary losses might learn to fit together without forcing. Colt reached for Miriam's hand across the board of the step, his fingers calloused, warm, known. He did it simply, like handing over a tool. It was not a claim, so much as an offering. She took his hand and felt, in that small contact, the map of a life sketched by acts rather than declarations. "Thank you," he said, not with ceremony, but with the quiet gratitude of someone who had been given help when he most needed it. "For what?" she asked. "For staying," he said, "for being the kind of person who shows up." She considered replying with some self-deprecating joke, but a quiet answer seemed better. "I'm staying," she told him, "because I want to." He nodded, and in that nod lay something simple and steadfast. As seasons moved, so did the foal into adolescent strength. It became a creature that bounded across the yard and carried with it the memory of a fragile night and a hand that had touched its flank at the first breath. The mare's patient presence seemed to have taught everyone something, that life, when attended to, will push forward. Children who had watched a newborn find its legs found their own courage to claim new relations. Miriam often stood in the barn doorway, arms folded, watching the small festival of feeding and grooming and the maintenance of life. Each task, each careful motion, said more about her than any test result ever had. There were quiet nights of reflection, where she allowed herself to name the things that had shifted inside. The old shame had been attenuated by acceptance, but grief still lived in the corners. She permitted herself to have both. A dual truth. The person she had been, the losses she had borne, and the person she was becoming in a place sewn together by patience. A year after she first set foot on the Rowins' place, the valley held another small gathering. Not for festival, but in celebration of a simple, intimate reason. Colt's father's birthday, celebrated late because the old man had been away and the world had been busy. The meal was a modest one, with pies and roasted root vegetables and a cake faintly mashed but earnest. People came with an ease that had been earned. They brought tales of neighborly kindness. Agnes did not come, nor did she send regrets. The absence was a kind of punctuation, present, noticed, and not necessary. In the evening, after plates were cleared and children were sent to bed, Colin's father, an old man who had lived with the inevitability of seasons and the stubbornness of a good fence, took Miriam aside. The old man had watched, over the year, how she had fit into the house not like a puzzle piece forced into place, but like a seam plied with care. "You did right by those kids," he said, his voice rough as split wood. He did not need to be tender. His gratitude was practical, as if he were accounting for harvests. "You stayed, you worked, you held them when they needed it." Miriam felt the flush of being seen by someone who measured life by the long haul. She felt, too, the smallness of any answer she could give to such plain praise. "Thank you," she said. "That means a lot." Later, as the night thinned and the house loosened into sleep, she found lodging for a thought that had been surfacing. That her sense of worth had shifted from proving productivity to accepting affection. It was a small, insistent revolution, measuring value by being tended to as well as tending. That knowledge was what steadied her. The story's most difficult reckonings had already been taken in measured doses, not in thunderclap revelations. Agnes's voice had been met and set aside. The legal insinuations had been countered with neighborhood testimony. The valley's ledger slowly acquired more generous entries. Still, life, by its nature, reserves margins for smaller, private reckonings. There were moments when Miriam sat alone at the sink and let the old ache return like a tide. But this time it receded with the quiet certainty that she was not alone on the shore. Near the year's end, when frost began to silver the meadow, Colt took Miriam for a ride across the ridge. They went slowly, side by side, letting the world open before them, like a book with only the necessary words. They did not speak much. The silence was the kind that collects meaning. At the top of the hill, the horizon fell away into a wide possibility. The valley lay under a sheet of pale sky, and the light made the farmhouse a small cluster of warmth amid the cool field. Colt slid from his horse and offered Miriam his hand. He had a quietness about him then, as if he were about to do something deliberately ordinary. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small, plain ring, nothing ornate, just a band of hammered silver that caught the sun in a modest way. "This is not about fixing anything," he said, because he knew where such things could go if left unsaid. "It's about staying. It's about calling what you already are by a name so we don't have to keep pointing at it. Will you keep being here, with us, in the way you already are?" There was no drama in the gesture, no urgency that demanded an immediate answer like a court's verdict. It was a question of continued choosing. Miriam's throat tightened, not from being asked to do something she could not, but because the offer was an invitation to make the place of belonging visible in a small, durable object. She accepted with the same steadiness she had learned to hold. "Yes," she said simply. They both laughed then, not with levity, but with the relief of two people making a small, irrevocable promise that echoed the quiet rhythms of their days. It was not a promise about children, nor about erasing past loss. It was instead a naming of a new kind of family, one that took shape in hands put to work and in quiet defenses against outside judgment. Spring returned again, and with it a sense of renewal that was less like a miracle and more like a slow, persistent insistence that life goes on. The foal, now hoarse in its adolescent grace, nicked at a stable door with the confidence of a creature that has been tended. The children grew in predictable, uneven measures. Miriam found her place solidified not by a single event, but through accumulation. 1,000 small acts of care that had become, in the valley's ledger, a convincing testament. One evening, as the light went thin and the porch lantern threw a steady circle of gold, Miriam sat where she had first said the words that began to turn things. "I'm home." This time, the phrase fit into the sentence of her life, with a fullness she had not known possible. Children's laughter sifted through the screen door. Colt stood at the corner of the porch, elbow propped, watching with a look of a man who had seen a field return to health after winter's killing. The stars were clean and sharp above, and a breeze moved the lamplight like a slow, soft hand. Etta came running down the path with a jar of fireflies she had caught, with the boyish triumph of someone who had conquered a small, perfect thing. She clambered onto the porch, setting the jar down, and immediately fell into a familiar routine, curling up on the step, leaning against Miriam, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Samuel and Eli argued over who got the top bunk in whispers that made them both grin. All of it was ordinary and miraculous in the quiet way ordinary things can be. Colt took Miriam's hand, the same simple gesture that had come to mean so much, and let his thumb make a slow pass over the back of her hand. They did not need words. The porch was a place of consensus, a place where small decisions are made and remade. "You remember the first night?" Etta asked suddenly, voice small and earnest. "When you came and sat, and the house felt sad?" Miriam closed her eyes for a heartbeat, and let the memory settle like a dusting of flour on a table. "I do," she said. "I remember how quiet everything was, like it was waiting for someone to set it right." "It's not right," Etta corrected, as if setting facts straight. "It's ours." Colt smiled, and something in the world felt circular and complete. Miriam lifted her chin and breathed in the night. The hay, the smoke, the distant dog, the cool metal of the porch rail. Her chest felt open in a way that did not deny the hollows within. The doctor's voice had not been erased, nor had the husband's absence dimmed. Those things were part of her landscape, but they no longer defined the horizon. She leaned her head back against the slats and felt the night like a fabric holding. Then, very quietly, she said to the air and to the people around her and to herself, "I'm home." Colt's reply, when it came, was as simple and weighty as ever. He said the line that had first shocked her and several people in that first kitchen conversation, but this time it carried the proof of months lived together. "I told you there was enough love here," he said. "There's enough for all of us." It was not a pronouncement of erasure, it was an insistence of presence. The measure of any life in that statement was not the number of heirs it might produce, but the hands that show up when things need doing, the voices that call across a table, the children who will wait up for a scraped knee. That night, the fireflies glowed like small, earthly stars inside a glass jar. The house breathed around them, steady as a drum. Miriam understood, in a keen and still way, that being broken had not excluded her from being integral. She had been reconstituted, not by a change in biology, but by a rearrangement of meaning. Dignity had returned, not as a fiat issued from without, but as a return of the world's regard, one neighbor at a time. If this story has touched you, if you carry someone else's old verdict close and would like to offer them a different ledger, share this with someone who believes in second chances. Would you choose belonging over blood? They sat on the porch until the lamp burned low. In the barn, the mare settled and the horse kicked at a hay bale in a lazy way that said all was fairly well. The valley exhaled its night air, and the house kept its small constellation of lights. Miriam let herself at last fall not into oblivion, but into a well-worn, welcome place. She had been broken in the way the world measures such things. She had been put together in the only way that mattered to her now, by being chosen, by choosing back, by showing up, day after day. Outside, the road stretched into darkness, and the world turned on. Inside, with the ordinary sounds of plates and the quiet breathing of children, a woman who had once thought her story ended in a sterile room had rewritten her life in the patient ink of small acts and shared labor. She had not been healed in the miraculous sense people sometimes hoped for. She had been gathered and kept. The cowboy's simple reply, the one that had startled a room and pushed the edges of a secret back, remained the hinge upon which everything else turned. It was not a cure. It was a kindness the world had not expected, and that had, in its stead, made room for a life. She watched the jar of fireflies until the light inside dimmed, and the insects took their leave, rising into the wide sky. The children drifted to sleep, one after another. Colt's hand found hers and squeezed, firm and quiet. She felt the press of the world that had once told her she was broken soften under that grip. She let it be so. When she finally went to bed, she did not carry the leather bundle anymore. She left it in the chest, by the window, as if it were a relic of a trip that had been necessary and painful, but had a purpose. Now, the house held other things: mended curtains, a jar of buttons for which no one yet had need, the smell of lemon peel drying on a plate. The small inventory of belonging had been built out of these pieces. Morning came as mornings do, slow, inevitable, with a kettle on the stove and the scent of bacon. It was ordinary and glorious. Miriam rose, made a pot of coffee, and filled a cup for Colt before the day demanded anything dramatic of them. She placed it by his plate, the movement so familiar it needed no thought. He looked up, surprised in a small, private way, and mouthed, "Thank you," without needing to speak it aloud. They ate together as a family. No proclamations, no grand gestures, only the soft commerce of people living in a place that asked less for proofs and more for presence. Outside, a foal ran in a wide, looping arc, finding the joy of its limbs. The children chased, their shouts catching on the light. The land hugged them with the promise of more days, each stitched to the next with the ordinary thread of work and affection. Miriam walked to the fence and put her hand on the wood. The grain was rough and honest, warmed by the sun. She listened to the wind and to the faint music of a life that had been pieced together from small, unglamorous moments. She thought of the doctor, of Agnes, of the house she had left behind. Those pieces remained in her, not erased but arranged differently. Old furniture moved into a new room. She had chosen this arrangement. She had chosen to stay, to be held by a family that had chosen her in return. In the end, the measure of belonging here was not a ledger of biology, but of care. The cowboy's reaction, the quiet, unfussy line that shocked everyone at a table, was not a sensational rescue, but a steady, human choice. It had altered a life not by fixing what some said was broken, but by refusing to let that claim stand alone. Miriam inhaled the open air and felt the slow, sure lift of something that was as much relief as it was acceptance. She had a place to set down the old verdicts, a place that would not deny her losses, but would not allow them to define her entirely. She had hands to hold hers when needed, laughter to break a day's tarnish, work to fill her purposeful hours. She raised her face to the sky as if in thanks, though it was prayer without doctrine, just gratitude for the small, steady mercies that had come her way. Then she walked back to the house, where the sound of children's voices rose like a promise, and she felt profound in the most ordinary sense, as one who had been chosen and had chosen back. "I'm home," she said again, a statement that was not the end of any story, but the honest center of the one she would live from here on. The house answered with the clatter of breakfast, the call of a child, the creak of a gate. The valley was, as it always was, open, sometimes cruel, often tender. And in its wide embrace, Miriam had found a place where being broken did not make her unworthy. It made her human, held by hands steady enough to keep going.